One of the phrases you hear often in forest monasteries is that the practice is about building Parami. It's a useful term. It refers to developing the spiritual perfections or spiritual qualities that grow in our heart through the practice. And you might say become stored in our heart, our mind. So that somebody who's ripe, mature for understanding the truth, the Dhamma that leads to liberation, is somebody whose Parami are well developed or complete. They talk about the Lord Buddha himself had perfected the 30 paramis, so 10 paramis on 3 levels: ordinary parami, upaparami, paramatta parami. Teachers often don't go into such detailed analysis of parami. As I said, tend to talk about parami in a general way, because because it's almost generally understood that Parami refers to all the different qualities. If you outline them as in the books, it's the 10 paramis. You can go through them, describe them. They're not so much teaching or commenting on a particular method. You develop this parami in this way. It's more just pointing to the growth of the mind through the practice, how all these different qualities are coming up, and they're linked. They arise together in different ways. They support each other. Ajahn and many other teachers used to say, if you don't have any obstacles in the practice, then Parami doesn't develop. So actually the nourishment for our Parami building is the problems, the obstacles we meet. Just coming into the robes, into the monastic form, already you've had to have cultivated a certain amount of parami. Whether you believe in birth and rebirth, the cycle of birth and death and past lives and future lives, or whether you just look at your own life in this life since you've been born, obviously to get to the point where you make a decision, a commitment to come into a monastery and train, means there have to be certain strengths and qualities in the mind that make you willing to take that step, because it's obviously not an easy decision for many people. It's quite an unusual one in our society. Just coming into the monastery, they say, is the practice of nekama parami, practice of renunciation. You're giving up the more normal way of the world, which is accumulation, gaining wealth, fame and fortune, possessions, interesting pleasant experiences and so on. It's the more normal way human beings live. When you come into a monastery, you're giving up much of that. You're renouncing that kind of habit of mind to always accumulate more. And we give up money, we give up the rights over property and different forms of wealth. And we do that straight away when you take on the precepts of a monk. That's also embodied in Sila Parami. Renunciation is more pointing more deeply into the mind that underlines many of our precepts. Precepts are more a sense of personal discipline. And you're there, often rules, guidelines, practices that we are obliged to do, to follow. It's about disciplining yourself. Underlying it is sense of renunciation, being willing to give up, give away material wealth and the desire to accumulate. So giving up the basic craving and attachment that underlies the cause of our suffering as human beings. They say somebody who can't stay in a monastery very long, often one way of looking at that is to say, oh, maybe the Nekama Parami is not yet well developed. Some people literally just want more comfort because the monastic life is so simple. Simplicity, moderation is the flavour of the monastic life. So some people find just need more comfort, more things around them. They have to be practicing on a level where they're practicing in comfort, so they go home. Might still practice Buddhism, have faith in the teachings, meditate, keep the 5 precepts perhaps, but maybe not yet ready to give up on the level of a Buddhist monk, a bhikkhu. Much of the monastic training is directly encouraging us and helping us to build parami, which is why it's often not talked about so much in detail. So it's just happening all the time. It's just obvious, right, to keep this and follow this lifestyle, follow the rules, keep putting effort into meditation, keep living in this way. You're necessarily going to be developing parami. The first parami they talk about, in lists of the 10 paramis, usually it's generosity. Even that, sometimes we might overlook and think, now I'm a monk, I don't have any money or wealth, I can't make donations or give gifts. But obviously it's something you can still practice as a monk. Practice of generosity, it comes from generosity of heart. So sometimes we do actually give small material gifts. We share things, we share food. In a monastery like this, we're well supported, so we share a lot of our requisites and gifts that people kindly give us with those who are less fortunate. We send to the homeless and to the soup kitchens of Melbourne and so on. Or we sometimes share amongst each other in the way the system that Ajahn taught us and gave us. We have a central store of requisites, and we share them with those in the community who need them, on a as-needed basis. We can request things. Sometimes we see somebody needs something, we might share what we know is available. So sharing and practice of generosity is still very much at the heart of our lifestyle. We share our time. We help look after the lodgings, the buildings, the grounds, keep things clean, both for ourselves and for the laity. We obviously practice dana on the inner level of the giving, as I say, abhaya dana, giving of forgiveness and fearlessness, in the sense a monastery is a place where you can come and be without fear that you're going to be harmed by the resident monks. This is why we see this year so many animals coming into the monastery every evening, because it's a place where we don't hunt or kill or harm animals. They sense that, whereas outside in the forest they're always getting hunted and chased. Lay people come here and feel relaxed because they know they're not going to get harassed or meet with aggression or situations that would make them feel threatened, because it's a place of safety and forgiveness. But that's a practice in itself. Obviously, sometimes we're provoked or tempted to be more aggressive if somebody provokes us. We have to consciously practice abhaya dana, giving of forgiveness, practice patience, kanti parami, practice metta parami. You see, in the course of our practice, the paramis are developing all the time together, supporting each other. Really, you can't separate the paramis out from each other. Like when you talk about dana parami, so you talk about abhaya dana, the giving of safety or giving of fearlessness to others. And what does that involve? Well, it involves giving up or giving away your anger or more aggressive, harmful tendencies. Ajahn used to use this term. He said, when you get angry, give it away, give away your anger as dana. It doesn't mean indulge it and take it out on someone and actually say or do something to harm somebody. What he was referring to is the mind, state of mind, that mental state of anger or ill will, cruelty. You give it up from the mind, you abandon it. You might call that the practice of dana or metta or panya or sila. In so many ways they're all pointing to the same thing. Yeah. The paramis are helping us to train our mind to give up the more unwholesome states that cause us suffering, lead us to make karma with others, cause others suffering as well. But you can see, if you're reflecting on this, just mental states that are unwholesome, unskillful, it's a form of giving. It's just to give them up from the mind. You abandon them. And the highest form of giving is obviously Dhamma. And sharing what understanding you have with others. Other members of the community, the laity who come to visit, and so on. Sometimes sharing the Dhamma doesn't even mean saying any words. It can be just through practicing the Dhamma, through an example, being restrained, peaceful, putting effort into your meditation, putting effort into following the different practices of the day, When it's time to work or do chores, you do it diligently. When it's time to meditate, in a group meeting you come. All of that is a form of dana, helping others, supporting others, just as much as giving a Dhamma talk or a formal teaching. With Sila Parami, so as monks, it's the practice of the Vinaya. Obviously it's something we all have to learn in the lay life. We never had such a refined and detailed set of rules and guidelines to follow. So for most lay people, they can't help but follow desires, moods much of the time. We often, as lay people, even fool ourselves into thinking that's true freedom, to be able to do what you want, when you want, in the way you want, and so on. But as we come to practice, we realize more that following your moods doesn't lead to true peace and happiness or wisdom. Often leads us to more confusion and suffering. So when you come into the monastery, your Sila Parami is being developed. You have to give up to the Vinaya, the training rules, the discipline. In the early days of Buddhism, say the first half of the Buddha's life, once he started teaching, maybe 20 years, there was no formal Vinaya. It was informal, because you might say the Sila Parami of the early disciples of the Buddha was well developed, established. They just kind of naturally understood what is right and wrong, appropriate, inappropriate in terms of behavior. They naturally live very simply in a harmless way. And many of them were already Aryapugalas, enlightened beings. But as the Sangha grew in number, more people came in, obviously, you might say the level of the parami of each individual maybe not sustained at that initial intake of disciples, not on the same level. So people have more kilesas, more cravings, more attachments. So gradually over time, the Buddha had to start laying down training rules, guidelines. So by the end of his life, we have the Vinaya, which we still study and practice today. This is a certain kind of parami, isn't it? You're learning to discipline yourself, following a set of rules that govern your behavior, your external behavior. It takes effort. It takes understanding, motivation, and so on to do that. Some of the rules, especially in the beginning, can seem fiddly or annoying. Sometimes they don't seem to have much point. Sometimes they seem to take up a lot of time because they're new. We have to keep remembering them, following them. You have to keep reminding yourself of the value of them. You're training your external behavior, and that means developing your certain qualities, composure, restraint. But this is helping you to develop a more subtle awareness and mindfulness of the mind itself inside. If we didn't have the Vinaya training on the outside, be very difficult for most people to really see their minds and come to enough clarity and have enough peace to weed out the causes of suffering, the cravings, the attachments that are constantly conditioning us. So the Vinaya is a useful vehicle, but it requires commitment, discipline. That's something we often have to learn. We learn Sila Parami until it becomes just normal for us. In the beginning it's something unusual, new, but as you practice, then maybe over time you appreciate the Vinaya more and more, how it, by following it, prevents you from creating suffering for yourself and others, helps your mind to be more peaceful, more content within itself. And as you appreciate it more, it just becomes more natural, more easy. It's something like just eating in the morning. Maybe you're only eating once a day in your bowl. In the beginning that might be something new that you have to put effort in. Maybe in the evening, if you've been putting forth effort, walking meditation or working or something, you might feel peckish, feel hungry. You think, it'd be nice to have food. But we have our training, we have to wait until the next day to eat. We don't just go to a kitchen and pick up food when we want. We have to eat at the proper time. We have a proper way that we receive food, distribute the food. We meditate before we eat. All of this, you can say, is Vinaya training. Inwardly, we might have desires coming up. We might be very hungry, just want to gorge ourselves sometimes. But we have to learn how to be patient with that. So, Kanti Parami, patience, endurance, help us to get through sometimes when we're feeling hungry or tired or weak. And they have a saying in Thailand, like, Kanti, as we know, Kanti Parami is the supreme destroyer or incinerator of defilements. They compare Kanti Parami to the rubbish incinerator that burns up all the rubbish you put into it, just leaves a little bit of ash at the end, nothing left. They say, use Kanti to burn up the defilements, don't let the defilements burn you up. Meaning if you leave your craving and attachment undealt with, unaddressed, you don't practice with it, well, it will burn you up. Rather than using the Paramis to burn up the craving and attachment that you have in the mind. It just burns you up, so you're constantly hot, agitated, caught into states of suffering. So just something as simple as eating one meal a day at an appointed time. You're practicing the Paramis and you're training yourself to let go of different desires. So when the desire, say, to eat at another time pops up, you just remind yourself, the rule is I eat at this one time. I have to wait, to be patient. We do have certain ways to offset. We have drinks. We can fill our stomach even with water if we want, as much water as we want. But you practice patience. And you're building Parami, and then over time it becomes normal. And the reason the Buddha stipulated this rule, one of the reasons he said, is because it's healthy to eat in the morning and just one meal a day. The reason that rule came about is because as the Sangha grew, in the beginning most monks just naturally went for their alms round in the morning, collected food. As most meditators will know, to eat in the morning it's healthy and suitable for meditation, so that in the rest of the day you're feeling light, you've digested your food, meditation is easier. Most of the earlier generation of monks understood that. But as time went on, some monks, because there was not yet any rule about when you can go on alms round, some monks thought, the food you get in the evening is actually better, it's tastier. As we know, in the lay life, people tend to put more effort into cooking in the evening. Nobody goes to a restaurant at 9, 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the morning. You might go for a quick breakfast or something. If you go out to a restaurant or you go to someone's house for a meal, it's nearly always dinner in the evening. So that's when the best food's around. So the cravings, the desires of monks meant they would go out in the evening looking for food. But that brought associated problems. You're walking in the dark, monks would fall into ditches and canals, trip over cows that were wandering around the street, and even scare people, till finally one monk waiting in the back of somebody's house hoping to get some food one evening. There was a thunderstorm. A lady come out washing her dishes, having cooked some food. He was waiting there with his bowl to get some food, and the thunder, lightning lit him up. She was so startled she thought it was some kind of devil or ghost come to haunt her. Complained to the Buddha. So the Buddha introduced that rule that we have to eat before midday. Stop monks going for alms round in the evening. Even then, when the Buddha laid down different rules, some monks, even though they had followed the Buddha into the robes out of faith in him and trusted in his wisdom and compassion, they still weren't happy. Just like when we come into the robes, some of the rules we're maybe not happy about, that we have to do this or not do that. The Venerable Udayi had already been practicing many years. He was upset that the Buddha put an end to going alms round at any time, said you can only eat in the morning. He said, he had this still a subtle sense of self-righteousness. I've put all this effort into my practice. I've come here, I've given up so much, committed to the practice, and now the Buddha won't let me go alms round in the evening. So he's upset. But he had Sila Parami. He didn't go and make a big fuss about it or argue, but in his mind he was upset. He wasn't happy with this new rule. But he went off to practice. Later on, meditating, he came to a realization. He's thinking how much the Buddha had helped him. Even though he's still not enlightened, he had already changed so much since he first began practicing the Buddha's teachings. His new virtues that weren't there in his mind before had come up. He was more peaceful than before, wiser than before, had more compassion than before. Reflecting like that, he realized, the Buddha's teachings, this training, the Vinaya, the Dhamma, has helped me. I should really appreciate it more. So his discontent with the rules past faded, and the appreciation of the teaching and the way of practice came up to replace it. As we develop Parami, it's like that. Often just being patient with our own moods and desires as we practice. We watch the ups and downs of the mind, the highs and the lows. Little by little we come to more understanding, but you have to give it time. And the opposite of Khanti Parami, the opposite of patience, is impatience. We're not willing to give time to anything. Again, that's often a habit we bring into the monastery with us from the world. So now, modern day and age, we're used to technology, deadlines, time. Everything is, we're trying to control the world all the time, control our lives all the time. The result of that is we're often very impatient. If we do put forth any effort into something, we want to see results quickly. We don't want to wait later on in our life or even another life. We want to see the results now. In the old days, you had to wait for a newspaper to be delivered, or you had to go and buy it. Now you just want to get on the internet and quickly get the news. You want to contact someone. Maybe in the old days you had to wait until you visited them, travel to see them. Now you want to be able to phone them or email them immediately, and so on. That's the way the modern world is now. It's encouraging us to be impatient if we're not mindful and aware of what's going on. We bring that into the monastery. So when we're meditating, often we want to see quick results from our meditation. We want to know what the Buddha taught. We want to have knowledge and wisdom quickly, now, instantly. So we have to work with that. You have to practice the opposite. Practice patience where there's impatience. Tolerance where there's intolerance. Like over and over again, the Buddha pointed out, the things we have to be patient with, often very ordinary things like weather. Especially in the winter, we get stormy weather, cold weather, wet weather, and you can't avoid it because you're living in the forest, in the mountains. You have to learn to be patient with it. You have to be patient with health issues. Our health is never perfect. We catch colds, we get aches and pains and sores and cuts. Sometimes we get more serious illnesses. We have to be patient with that. Something that the Sangha of Ajahn Chah, especially the older generation, you see the value of the way they've practiced from the teachings they received from Ajahn Chah, how to be patient with the discomfort of the body, feelings of heat and cold, pain, hunger, which are just part of our human condition, but we so often try to avoid, cover over through comfort, technology and so on, or through distraction just to get away from anything unpleasant. We try to distract ourselves by seeking out different kinds of pleasures. In the older generation, you see, Ajahn Chah's disciples all have great patience when it comes to physical difficulties and challenges and so on. One of the first teachings I was given, like when I was a young monk, probably the worst illness I had was my first year, just ordained, and it was my first fast. I was eating, they say, dokbat, which means go into the village and you just eat the food you get in your bowl on alms round from the village, not taking any food when you come back to the monastery. It's a very uncertain kind of meal. Some days even just plain rice, some days just a few items to go with the rice. And then there was an outbreak of amoebic dysentery in the village. So people would pass it to each other through hand contact usually, dirty hands touching food. So myself and a novice caught amoebic dysentery from the villagers, from the food. And it's one of the first times I thought, once I had become a monk, it's one of the first times I thought I might die. It was so intense, the pains, the headaches, the fevers, the diarrhea, the dehydration. The Sangha was very kind. They have metta parami. They would come and see me every day, bring me medication, see what I needed. But there's not a lot you can do in those situations. You just lie there, very tired, worn out, and don't even have a mattress in those days. Just a very thin mat on a wooden floor with a little pillow. And literally just passing the time over and over again, hour after hour, not doing very much at all other than just being with a feeling of discomfort. One of the monks quite sincerely came in first day and said, well, you know what Ajahn Chah says in these situations, you either get better or you die. You might call that panya Parami, wisdom Parami. It's just telling me the truth. And that's how it was. You either get better or you die. So my good fortune, I got better. And all the Sangha practiced in that kind of way. Didn't always go to hospital, didn't always have access to a doctor or the best medical treatment. Sometimes you did, sometimes you didn't. The result was you learned great patience. Like someone was telling me, someone visited the other day, talking about Lumpo Bunchu, one of the most senior disciples of Ajahn Chah. The doctors, he's now very elderly and he's got problems with his thyroid, and the doctors want to operate because he's not eating much, he's getting very skinny, very weak. And he said, well, whether I operate or not, I'll die anyway. he's developed enough patience, enough wisdom through his practice that he's really not bothered by the thought of death. And he's not a foolish man, he's looked after himself, he's taken medicines and had treatments, but he's also just displaying the fact that he's not put off by a little bit of discomfort. You might also call that upekkha parami, equanimity or evenness of mind towards the different conditions that we have to experience as human beings. Usually in the list of 10 that comes at the end, equanimity is the aim of our practice. Equanimity that's with all the other paramis together, with wisdom, with samadhi, with sila, with understanding, is the equanimity of just samadhi alone, so the development of one-pointedness of mind, where you can keep your mind firm and unshakable towards all conditions, not giving in to the hindrances, to doubt, worry, anger, greed, desire, sleepiness, and so on. Then there's the even higher equanimity of upekkha towards conditions based on insight, just understanding that all conditions are impermanent and not self. A monk like Lumpur Bunchu is practiced to the point where he just knows intuitively, with wisdom, with equanimity, that this body doesn't belong to you. If you have that sense of non-attachment towards the body, then there's no suffering, even when it has pain or illness. You just know that's the nature of this body. It's anicca, it's dukkha, it's anatta. So quite naturally, this practice that we're following, you could call it the forest tradition, we're developing all the paramis quite naturally. As long as you're in the monastery practicing, you'll be developing parami. They say parami is only really parami when it's part of your mind, it becomes part of your makeup. While we're developing parami, then we're putting effort in, we have to try, and sometimes the qualities, the spiritual qualities are there, sometimes they're not. We lose the parami. Sometimes we get angry, sometimes disheartened, discouraged. Sometimes we get lazy, and so on. The idea is you keep practicing, perfecting these parami, then they actually become part of you. So once they're part of you, they can't be dislodged very easily by conditions. Maybe you have your ups and downs, but there's always something there that keeps you going. Parami. Another thing the Buddha said we have to have patience towards, kanti parami, is people. There's the weather, there's health, there's people, living with people. And part of our practice is living as community. Even if you go off on retreat, you still have certain relationships with other monks, teachers, preceptors, senior monks, junior monks. You have a relationship towards the lay community who support you. Wherever you're living in the world, whether you're living alone or in a monastery with a large community, there's people who support you. We don't have money, we don't store food, so there's always going to be somebody who's having to help share their food with you, share the material things they have with you. So we have to learn how to be patient with people. Again, that's often a test of our parami when we come into the monastery. You're learning to live as a community, surrounded by people from different backgrounds, different opinions, different knowledge levels, different cultural backgrounds, different habits, different characters, personalities. So at first, sometimes that's a little bit of a shock. So you see monks, or new monks often, they hide away, they run away. Their parami is not yet very strong, so somebody near them says just a few words that they disagree with already, the anger comes up. They don't want to be there, worried they might get into an argument. They might have sila parami, they don't display anything, but inwardly anger might come up. Anger is not something you can just discipline like sila, like you can stop yourself abusing someone or speaking harsh words to someone through discipline, through making yourself stop. When you're tempted to lose your temper with someone, that's sila parami. But the anger, the ill will that's actually driving that is internal, and you can't just stop that through an act of will and say, I'm not going to get angry. It's not enough. It might actually lead to some mental problems, trying to repress anger too much. The only way to deal internally with the defilements, the cravings, the attachments we have is through developing wisdom, mindfulness wisdom, seeing them as anicca, dukkha, anatta, developing to the point where you can actually let go of a negative mental state. That takes practice. Again, takes patience, takes effort, virya parami, takes wisdom, insight, all the paramis working together. It takes metta, we have to develop some goodwill towards ourselves, towards others, and so on. But until we've done that, we might have to, in the beginning, just rely on patience, khanti parami. Be very patient with the different emotional reactions that come up as we live in a community. We have our preferences. We're always judging other people, what they say, what they do, comparing, looking. We tend to look outwards too much, not looking at ourselves very much. But over time, if we keep practicing, then that changes around. And you're not so upset or bothered by other people. You become more bothered by your own mental defilements, your own attachments. Usually they're the real problem. It's not so much other people that are the problem, it's your own wild thoughts, unwise thoughts, uncompassionate thoughts. They're the real cause of suffering. So as parami comes up, maybe not only on the outside you become more peaceful and composed, but on the inside you find more inner peace as you start to let go, give up some of the more negative mental states, the greed, the anger, the ill will, the cruelty, and ultimately the delusions. The hardest of all, and most Buddhists would agree, is the delusion of self. It's the way we constantly identify with this body, this mind as a self. And we can hear the words of the Buddha, read them, listen to explanations of them. There is no self, it's anatta. This body and mind is empty of any kind of ego or lasting essence or self, substance. But it's just the words of other wise people, and we can remember them, and it's not the same as knowing and experiencing for ourselves. That can only come through repeated investigation, looking at the truth, coming to understand as an experience what not self is. But you'll see the parami help us to get to that point in developing all these parami. Even just practicing sila parami can sometimes lead to a direct realization of not self. Because as you keep the sila, so you do have a strong mental state coming up based on craving. Maybe you have a strong desire for something that you can't have, say sexual desire or desire for food or some requisite. Or you have some strong aversion come up. You're very angry and you want to shout at somebody or damage something or whatever. But you establish your sila parami, so you're not going to act on that desire, then it forces your mind to start looking at the root cause of that desire. So it brings up panya parami. You start seeing the nature of desire as something that is impermanent. Because if you're not acting on that desire, well, it will arise and then it passes away. It's not like you have desire come up all day long, all night. It has its moments, it comes and then it goes. As you're watching and learning from your experience, then the inner wisdom parami starts to come up. So directly from keeping the sila leads on to maybe an insight into the impermanence of mental states. What is impermanent, the Buddha said you can't take as self because it's impermanent. You can't own something that disappears on you or ceases. You know, how many times have we got angry? How many times have we had sexual desire? How many times have we had different forms of worry or sadness? All the different mental states of suffering, they don't last. What doesn't last, you can't really take as a self. You don't really own that, even though you're witnessing it, experiencing it. It will disappear in its own time. So sila parami leads straight on to panya parami sometimes, straight onto the insight into not self. Little by little then, the paramis grow up together and they mature. So you get this sense of contentment, of, you might say, completeness that comes from the practice. If you give it time, obviously very few people get quick overnight results in the practice. They might have moments of insight, but for most of us it's a gradual awakening of the mind. We come to more understanding, we develop the skills, the qualities that help the parami grow, help our mind to grow, open up, see the Dhamma, understand the Dhamma. So if you're willing to do that, you're willing to give it the time, keep practicing, then there's always a chance for enlightenment. There's always a chance for the mind to really grow and change for the better, to improve. This is what our teachers have proven to us and shown to us. This is what the Buddha showed to us. Now it's our chance to practice for ourselves. So I'll leave you with these reflections tonight.